Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And on today's episode, I have two special guests, Dr. Mick Kling and Craig Moritz. Dr. Kling is the owner of a 2-location practice and is a practice management and transition advisor for Vision Source. And Craig is with Vision Source as well as the director of strategic programs. And we talk on a high level about the process of transitioning ownership internally. So an owner passing on ownership to an associate doctor within the practice. We talk about when it makes sense to start thinking about transitioning ownership, how both the buyer and the seller evaluate whether it makes sense. We talk about the steps of the process, due diligence, where lending comes in, and so much more. Both Mick and Craig bring just a ton of experience with practice transitions to the whole conversation, and just due to the amount of time we had together, I feel like we barely scratched the surface here. So maybe this is the start of a longer series on practice transitions here on the podcast. And if you have any questions about anything we talked about today, feel free to reach out at Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. And you can check out all the show notes and resources mentioned in the show. And you can check out all the links and resources mentioned in the show notes, which you can find at the Education Hub on my website, optometrywealth.com. And while you're there, check out all the other articles and episodes, and feel free to schedule a no-commitment introduction call to talk about what's on your mind financially and to learn how we help ODs nationwide master their cash flow, proactively plan around taxes, and so much more. This topic is one of my favorite questions to plan around. For example, how do we plan for purchasing a practice? So I thought it was fascinating, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Mick Kling and Craig Moritz. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I'm your host, Evon Mendrin, and on today's episode, I am thrilled and excited to have two very special guests today. Would love to welcome to the show, Dr. Mick Kling and Craig Moritz. Thank you both so much for coming on today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk about a topic that I am just fascinated with, but I think is also important to the longevity of private practice optometry, and or at least a piece of it, and that's internal transitions from an owner doc to an internal associate, to someone that's already working there. And before we dive into that, I just want to get a little bit of a background for both of you. And Craig, if we can start with you, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I have been with Vision Source for about 4 years now. I actually came from an energy background, and I have a finance degree. And so using that finance degree with Vision Source for what we call our next program has been really beneficial. I've been working with Mick and others, but primarily Mick on this program with Vision Source, this program being the next program, which we'll talk about as we move through this. But I am based in Houston, Texas, which is the Vision Source corporate headquarters. And that's a little bit about me right there.
Perfect. Mick?
Yeah, I'm an OD, as you mentioned, and based out of San Diego. I've got a 2-location practice, but I spend about 80% of my time as a practice management and transition advisor for Vision Source. And as Craig mentioned, one of the initiatives that Craig and I oversee is what we call the Vision Source Next program, and that's really the cradle-to-grave support that we provide for our members throughout their entire life cycle, their practice, what we call their practice life cycle. And that includes support, even as students, educating them about the benefits of independent optometry, all the way through graduation, assisting with placing them in Vision Source member practices as associates. Craig and I spend a lot of time helping young ODs purchase practices, and also spend a lot of time with our current members that are wishing to exit out of practice ownership and transition onto whatever is next.
And for anyone who's not heard of Vision Source, what is Vision Source? What is the main benefit of being affiliated with Vision Source as a practice owner?
Yeah, Craig, I'll take that, and then you can hit it from sort of the corporate side. But from an OD perspective, Vision Source was founded about 32 years ago by Dr. Glenn Ellisor, based out of Texas, and it has really evolved into a network of over 3,000 independently owned practices. We're a franchise organization, which means that each practice is independent. We make our own decisions, but collectively, this franchise organization allows us to have a lot of influence and muscle in the industry. Many people mistake us for a buying group. The benefit that you get from being a member on cost of goods savings is sort of the easiest thing to get your head around, because we absolutely guarantee the best pricing on everything. But really, we're about community, and we're about supporting independent optometry. So much of the value that our members get really is not about getting frames and lenses at a cheaper price. We certainly do that. It's about the community that we provide and create in the environment to help support and lift one another up in the independent eye care world.
Yeah, and really looking at it from the corporate standpoint, we've got so many different programs out there that are meant to just add value, add education opportunities, add, again, community, but also to help our members be as profitable and successful as possible, whether that's tools helping with managed vision care, whether that is, again, educational resources to help staff members, incentivize staff members to increase optical sales. We've just got so many different programs. I mean, we could go on and on about that. So it's, as Mick said, it's a cost of goods, but it's so much more than that. And you've really kind of got to get involved and see and experience it. One of the things that we do, we have an annual meeting called Exchange, and it's the annual gathering of our members and staff. And that in and of itself is probably worth, membership into Vision Source, just because of the information that is transferred back and forth, whether it be from the general session or just the one-on-one conversations that are had in the convention center itself.
Very cool. Yeah, I don't think enough can be said about the importance of a sense of community and getting that sort of mentorship and guidance from peers that have done it and from other people that have gone through whatever scenario a practice owner is going through throughout their journey. So that's really cool to see. And in both of your experience helping buyers and sellers transition practices, ownership from a seller to that next generation buyer, let's say we have that doctor owns the practice, has an associate or maybe associates within the practice. That doctor's thinking about the future and how that practice is going to transition, their own retirement plans and when their own career goals. When would it make sense in terms of an internal transition? When would it make sense for that owning doctor to think about transitioning or to pass on ownership to that next generation? When does it start to make sense to do that?
Yeah, this is a question that I get from our members quite frequently, and my stock answer is always sooner rather than later. Always be thinking about what your future is going to look like. So many times we have sellers that haven't given thought to how they're going to exit out. And then something comes up, let's say it's a health issue or a personal issue, and suddenly they need to move the practice quickly and they're very ill prepared to do that. So just even thinking about it years in advance is not too soon, in my opinion. We surveyed our members about a year ago, and about 30% of them indicated they were wishing to transition within the next 5 years. So we're going to have a lot of practices on the market in the next 5 years. The follow-up question was if you are thinking of transitioning out of ownership in the next 5 years, do you have a plan? And 70% of them indicated they had no plan of
Wow.
transitioning. So it's like, yes, I'm ready to go. I'm giving some thought to going, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there. And that's a very vulnerable position for a seller to be in, not just from the valuation standpoint, because you devalue your business when you don't prepare it to sell, but also just from the personal side of just the stress and anxiety of how to do the process.
In terms of, because there's a couple ways to go about it. I mean, an owner can wait until they're ready to exit the practice altogether and basically sell the entire ownership stake or the assets, or they can potentially allow the associate to buy in over time while they're still working there. Why would an owner go one way versus another? Like, why would an owner part with equity while they're still involved in the practice versus just wait till they're ready to exit altogether?
If I can answer part of that, let me go back to the previous question.
Sure.
So a great example, last year over the course of about, I don't know, 2 months, I got a call from several different associate doctors that had joined their practices. Some were actually with Vision Source members, some were not Vision Source members, but they had joined the practice in anticipation, and this is obviously, I'm only hearing one side of it, that they were going to be able to buy into the practice over time. They'd been there anywhere from 2.5 to 7 years, and in every case, the doctor was kind of kicking that can down the road. One non-member in a very rural area of a state had this associate had been there 7 years, and the associate was tired of not having that opportunity and so forth, and so he ended up leaving the practice. And he's left his doctor in a very precarious situation because it's going to be hard to get somebody to go in a very rural part of the state that he's in. So I would say tying it up as early as possible, just managing expectations when an associate comes on. If there's an opportunity for equity, whether it's in the near future or down the road, to put it in writing so that the expectations are out there for the associate, but also for the seller, so that that they have an agreement ahead of time, as opposed to one thinking one thing and the other thinking another.
Yeah, that's that failed internal succession plan from the associate side is something I've heard a lot about, both in optometry and even outside of optometry, even my own profession, is that there's an expectation that, okay, they'll be able to buy into the practice, like you said, and then it's just, okay, maybe next year or maybe 5 years. And that 5-year cycle just continues on and on and on. And eventually that associate leaves. And so you're thinking, in order to really avoid that issue of that failed succession plan, is to get that in writing, is to have clear expectations early on. And if it's reality, to put that in writing and to make sure there's actually something tangible there to work with.
Well, I think that's going to help with miscommunication. So Again, I only heard one side of the conversation. The doctor may not have said that, but that may be what the associate heard. And so by putting it in writing, it does manage those expectations on both sides. And so I think it can help for that smoother transition too, when that time comes, because some of that could be, how are we going to value the practice when that time comes?
Yeah, and to Craig's point, it's really all about communication. And in writing is always very clear, and it can live in perpetuity. But even just having a conversation early on. The tricky part is when you bring a new associate in, there really needs to be a period of dating. Both buyer or both employer and employee need to get to know each other, because the young OD might really have high aspirations that this is the practice I want to buy, but they need some time to really understand the culture of the practice and the finances of the business. The employer or potential seller needs to make sure that this is somebody that they feel comfortable transitioning the practice to. So, there needs to be some reasonable dating period. The problem is a lot of employer ODs start to make money off their employed ODs.
Right.
And so it becomes, hey, well, I'm not sure I'm ready to sell it. You're generating some good income for me. And so suddenly it becomes less important to sell the practice. That's why, to Craig's point, I think having that conversation up front sooner rather than later, preferably in writing, just to say, here's what our plan is. In 1 year from now, we are going to sit down and we're going to talk about what the future looks like, as an example. So very, very good advice.
Yeah. But in terms of that question, Mick, in terms of, maybe a doctor doesn't want to have a co-owner, when would it make sense to bring that next owner in and phases over time, that associate in, and allow them to purchase equity over time, versus wait till that owner's ready to leave the practice altogether and just sell the whole ownership? Why would an owner go one way versus another?
Yeah, so what I see is that every seller has a different motivation to sell. Sellers typically have what we call pushes and pulls. So there are things that are pulling them out of practice, like I want to go fishing, I want to spend time with my grandkids, I want to travel. And then they have things that are sort of pushing them out. So those are pulls. Pushes are things like, I'm sick of staff problems, I'm sick of the operational headache. So depending on where they are on that scale really has some impact on, do I just want to hand you the keys and walk away? I'm done with this. Or, you know what? I still want to have some operational control. I still want to keep my equity. So I'm willing to sell a smaller piece of the practice. So it really comes down a lot of times to their personal position in life and where they are in with all those personal issues. The one really great thing about selling a practice in tranches is that a seller can sell the business as it's increasing in value. So let's say this year I sell you 20% of the business. Next year I sell you 20% more. The following year, 20% more. I'm revaluing the business every single year and earning a little bit more. So I'm benefiting as a seller with the growth of that business. It's sort of like selling a stock as it's going up. Mm-hmm. Too many times a seller will make the emotional decision to sell, and then they start to become emotionally detached from the practice, and then the revenue starts to decline. And it's very hard to argue value of a business that has declining revenue. And so selling it in pieces as it's going up, in my opinion, is a much better strategy than trying to sell the whole thing as it's heading on its way down.
Interesting. And I wonder if part of that too is just the risk profile or the characteristics of that practice. If it's a rural practice that they might feel it's difficult to find that next buyer down the road, and they know they have a great partner or a co-owner in front of them, maybe they want to lock in that future owner. Is that something they might consider as well?
I would say absolutely. Especially that becomes really important on a rural practice, as you mentioned, because how easy is it going to be for me to recruit somebody to come to cut and shoot Texas and practice and so forth. So if you've got an associate that likes the community and wants to be there, my advice would be to try to lock them up and sell them, something, give them some equity so they have a reason to stay and look forward to more. It's going to be a lot easier in a metropolitan area to find a buyer than it is going to be, in that smaller community.
Yeah.
Even though some of those smaller communities are going to have a much more robust practice, a very robust practice, just because they pull from so far away.
Yeah, interesting. And from both perspectives, the seller or the senior doctor and the buyer, how would each one evaluate, from the seller's perspective, whether that associate is a good fit, whether it makes sense to co-own and partner with them, and from the buyer, the associate's perspective, whether they want to get into ownership, whether that's something they want to do and it makes sense? How do they evaluate that decision?
That Yvonne is a really good question, and because there's so many variables that play into somebody's decision to want to buy a practice in the first place, and also somebody's decision to want to sell the practice, and then who they feel comfortable selling the practice to. I always find it interesting when sellers are very particular about who they actually sell their practice to. And the reason is, and we see this a lot in the Vision Source ecosystem, there is a lot of concern about legacy. A lot of our members are very concerned about who is going to take over and continue on into the future what they've spent so many years building. There's concern about how are my patients going to be taken care of. There's concern about what's going to happen to my staff. So those are really big things that at least our members are highly, highly concerned about. Now, some people just sell because they want the highest price. We don't typically see that very often because of this whole issue of my legacy is the most important thing that I preserve, because this has become such a important thing to my life, and the support that I've provided in the community. So it's almost like buying a house. It's almost more emotional than anything, and sometimes sellers lose fact that they're just selling a business. It seems much more than that.
Yeah. There's a lot of years and time and effort and work and memories, good and bad, into those ownership shares, right? Into that practice. So I can definitely understand that. Where does that process start? Right. So let's say you have an owner and an associate. They both are sort of in agreement that they're willing to work together, that they're a good fit. Where does that process even begin from the very beginning?
Well, I think obviously it starts with that conversation, understanding what they that they want to move forward, and then from the owner perspective, what is the owner? How does the owner want to transition it? 100% or in percentages over time, and is that going to work for the buying associate? I think that's the first step. And then it's going to be, okay, well, how do we value the practice, and to agree, especially as Mick mentioned just a minute ago, if you're selling pieces of it over time, it's you're going to have an increasing asset. So understanding and agreeing how that's going to be valued over time, I think, is really important.
Craig and I often get inquiries from members that are wishing to sell, and the first question they seem to always ask is, "What's my practice worth?" And we don't provide valuation services or appraisal services. We don't tell members what their practice is worth, what they should sell it for. We don't tell buyers what they should pay. What we do is help them understand the economics. We take a deep dive into their profit and loss statement and try to figure out where all the money is, and that helps them sort out potentially what a bank might lend a buyer on the practice. But their question is, what's my practice worth? But I believe what they're really asking is, I don't know what to do. I don't know what this process is all about, because most optometrists buy one practice or start one practice and sell one practice during the arc of their entire career. And so they're really not prepared to even know how the process works. So I think while they're asking us, what's my practice worth? What they're really asking is, what do I do? Like, how do I sell this practice? What's the process? It's sort of like our patients call us and ask, how much is an eye exam? But what they're really asking is this a good place for me to go to get an eye exam? Is the doctor creepy? Is a place going to be welcoming to me? So it's sort of the question behind the question.
Yeah. So what is that process then? Because I would imagine there's some amount of due diligence. There's conversations between the two. There's maybe a letter of intent. Like what actually goes into the whole transaction?
Craig, why don't you just kind of explain how we go through the process of gathering information from the member, and then how we sort of work our way through the math.
Yeah. So the first thing that what we'll do is, again, to Mick's point, we will help them understand their cash flow and how it works. And so we provide them some a document that it's a questionnaire that they'll fill out, and then they will provide us a number of their financial documents over about a 3-year period. And we take that information, we put it into our model, and look at their expenses, what we can add back to get an idea of what their net income is, and then we show them how that would play out based on a value and a multiple of their EBITDA that we come up with, and how it will cash flow out. So the number that we give them, we're very clear to them. We're not telling you that this is what your practice is worth. We're just showing them how it will cash flow based on our scenario. And from there, they then need to decide exactly how they want to value it, and so forth. We're not looking at their inventory, their equipment, their furnishings, anything like that. So then they will come up with whatever they want to, how they want to value it. We've seen it in some cases go below our number, right at our number, and in some cases over our number. So from that standpoint, then the buyer would need to put together a letter of intent, and with that really kind of starts the process and the negotiation process of what they're willing to offer and pay, and then things start to kind of get rolling at that point.
I think the main value that we provide for our members when we go through that process that Craig just described is we identify where all the money is going in the practice. Because as a privately owned business, there can be lots of personal expenses that are run through the practice for tax reasons. When we want to save some taxes, so we run some personal expenses through the business. Everybody does it, very common. But we want to peel all that stuff out because we want to know the true cash flow of the practice, because what we're really trying to answer is how much free cash flow is available to service the debt. So if we were to go borrow money to buy this practice, we need to know how much cash flow is available to be able to repay the bank principal and interest, plus be able to cover any tax liability, because the principal portion that we repay the bank comes out of the profit of the business. So we just do that math to get our head around really what does this practice support from a debt service standpoint? Because at the end of the day, that's essentially what the banks are going to do to decide how much money they're going to lend a buyer. And so we just walk through that math with them. That's a very foreign exercise for most optometrists, because most of us have very little experience with that exercise. But it's very eye-opening, because sometimes at the end of the conversation, it's, you know what, you're not ready to sell this business. You need to go back and get your cost of goods in line, because there really isn't much profitability. Therefore, there isn't much value. Go get your cost of goods fixed, and then we'll analyze it, and that will increase the value of your business.
The one thing that we hear quite a bit is that they kind of overvalue their business. This business has so much potential, and if John comes in and buys my practice, he can go from 3 days to 5 days, and he can do this and do that, and so it should be worth a lot more. And one of the things that we have to talk about is that you can't value your business based on the work that somebody else is going to do. You have to value it at where it is when you sell it.
Yeah, a buyer's not going to buy potential, right? They're going to pay what the expected cash flow is going to be bringing in. Yeah, that's a really great point. And then, Mick, you mentioned a great point too, is that there is a difference between profitability on a profit and loss or an income statement versus cash flow. The profit and loss is due to accounting and tax rules, often a game to be played in order to get the most favorable tax outcome you can get. Cash flow is going to tell the real story. I mean, that's the actual cash activity in and out. And what a buyer's probably going to want to see, and a bank is also going to want to see, is there going to be cash to pay for the business expenses, pay for that buyer's expenses, and also cover the debt. Can you cover the debt? A couple questions following out from that is that when does a bank get involved? And what are some things that a buying doctor, the associate, should look at to say, okay, maybe this is something I should buy, or maybe this isn't something I should buy from the financial side?
Yeah, we work actually closely with a couple of lenders, one in particular, one large national bank. And we, and you are spot on, Evon, what you said. At the end of the day, all the bank cares about is, are we going to be able to get our money back? If we lend on this practice, what's the chance of us getting our money back? That's all. That's the only reason they do the entire exercise that they do. But most of the time, we bring the banker in sooner rather than later, because a lot of times the buyer and seller are kind of stuck on this valuation piece. Like, the seller doesn't really know what the practice is worth, what they should ask for it. The buyer doesn't know what they should pay. So we say, listen, you know what? Let's let the bank come in and do some underwriting, and let's see what they would be willing to lend on the practice. And oftentimes that is where the practices end up selling for, because the buyer has to really figure out, if the bank won't lend them anymore, how are they going to justify paying more for the practice? Because the bank did the math, and it'd be kind of foolish to pay more for the practice if the math doesn't support it. And the seller has to realize, well, I could try to get more out of the buyer, but that means I'm going to have to carry the note for anything above what a bank would lend, and that puts the buyer at much greater risk. And so you've got to get the most value for the seller, but you can't set the buyer up for failure either.
What would a bank, in terms of that, the buyer wanting to go to the bank and get lending in order to make the transaction work, what are some other things that a bank is going to look at when evaluating maybe the creditworthiness or whatever for that associate buying? What are some things that a bank is going to look at to make sure that they're going to be lending the money?
That's a great question. We work with the students. We're in the optometry schools talking to the students and so forth. And one of the, as we're talking about private practice and buying practices, starting practices, one of the things that they are concerned about is, you don't understand. I've got $250,000 in debt. No bank is going to lend on that. But what we found is that the banks understand that there is a cost to learning the craft of optometry, and that's going to be the student loan. And they understand that, and they're okay with that. One of the things that we really try to verbalize and very much is, when you get out of school, you've got that loan, and you may get out and you may start making a little bit of money, but don't go out and then get the $800 a month BMW car payment and then go buy a $400,000 house. So now you've built onto this personal debt over and above that student loan. So if they'll live a little bit more frugal on the front end, the banks are going to be much better. Obviously, the credit worthiness of the borrower, associate, or whoever it is, the buyer, is important. But keeping their personal debt level down prior to buying a practice is really key, because based on the size of the practice that they're buying, there may not be enough cash flow to cover all of those personal debts that they have.
Yeah. And I would just add to that. We talked about this math exercise of sort of determining what the free cash flow would support, but really what Craig just said is important, because what the banks really do is they actually look at the global cash flow of the borrower. In other words, they take into consideration, okay, here's what's left over after all the bills are paid in the practice. Then we have to take into consideration the personal lifestyle of the borrower, build that into the equation, and see what's left over to service the debt, and they base their the amount that they'd be willing to loan based on what's left over. So if you have a lot of student loan debt, 3 Tesla car payments and a big mortgage, and you like to take fancy vacations, all that stuff is going to work against you in the underwriting process when the bank is determining how much they're willing to lend on a practice. So in a very weird way, it's almost saying there's a portion of the value of this business that has nothing to do with the seller.
Yeah.
It's really about the buyer and the buyer's spending habits.
Yeah.
One more thing I would add on to that is having cash on hand for the buyer. The bank is typically going to want a certain amount of cash reserve from the buyer, and a number that we hear is about 7%. So if you're getting a $1 million loan, they're going to want about 70,000 in liquid cash. So I think that's important for buyers to keep in mind too. Don't burn through all your cash. Keep some available, and that's going to be cash that there's no penalty to retrieve. So if it's in a 401k, you're going to pay that 10% penalty. That's not what they're talking about, but it's going to be more liquid.
Yeah, they're looking at liquidity. I say quite a bit is that if you see practice ownership in your future, whether it's cold starting or buying in, you want to prioritize cash flow flexibility and liquidity and cash in the bank. And we can work with student loans. We can, whether it's paying it down altogether, whether it's staying in a federal student loan system and using the programs available, we can plan around student debt. But as soon as you start to add on other required payments into your life, into your budget, it's hard. You're creating a hill that you can't necessarily get over. So I think those are both really great points. Where does the space of the practice fit into this? Whether the location that the practice is working at, how does that fit into this whole due diligence valuation piece? And I'm assuming maybe that depends on who owns it. Like how does that fit into all this?
Yeah. So a lot of times, and I think this is a very important point. A lot of times sellers will say, I want to sell my practice, but I want to continue working 2 or 3 days a week. Well, that creates 2 potential problems. Number one is the practice may not be able to support the wage of you, the seller, 2 or 3 days a week, plus the buyer, because the buyer needs to generate income as well. So the practice size itself may not, from a revenue standpoint, may not support the seller staying around at the level that the seller would like to do that. The second issue is just physical capacity. There may not be enough room to run 2 doctors if the seller decides to stay. So you've got the physical space limitations that sometimes play into the negotiation process as well. And then the second part, which I think is really what you were asking about, was many of our sellers own the real estate. And so in many cases, the seller generally prefers not to sell the real estate at the same time they sell the practice. In other words, they would like to be the landlord for a while, generate some rental income as passive income, and then we always encourage the buyer to get a right of first refusal on the real estate if possible, if it's where they think they want to stay. But many times a bank won't lend on both the practice and the real estate at the same time to a borrower anyway. So a lot of times we see, hey, we'll lend on the practice, go ahead and buy the practice, become a tenant, rent the space for a year or 2 years, and then if you get the opportunity to buy the real estate, then you can, potentially buy the real estate. So I'm not sure if we necessarily answered your question, but 2 thoughts that popped in my head.
Yeah, and so that's if the selling doctor owns the real estate. There's going to be some tax reasons too why they would want to keep that property until after the sale and have it for a little while and maybe sell it a little bit later. From the bank standpoint, they're probably going to want to do, I guess, from what I'm hearing, is a separate loan on that property to purchase the actual property and probably have some money down, right? That's not going to be 100% finance. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's rare that we ever see a real estate loan and a practice loan bundled together.
Yeah.
They typically are handled separately. And in most cases, the real estate is held in a separate entity, an LLC outside of the
Yep.
practice. Let's say the practice is an S Corp and the real estate's held in an LLC. So it's pretty clean that way, but generally the bank will treat those as two completely separate transactions. And it makes sense because think about the collateral of each.
Yeah.
The collateral is quite different. Now they'll banks love to cross collateralize, meaning use the real estate to support the practice and the practice assets to support the real estate, but they typically are two separate loans.
What if the buyer does not, or what if the selling doctor does not own the property? What if they are currently leasing the property? What does a buyer need to look at in that scenario?
Well, they need to look at the lease as soon as possible. There needs to be some transferability. There needs to be the capability in the lease for transferability, or they're going to need to then start talking to the landlord about what it's going to take to transfer that and how that would work. Is it a new lease? Or I guess they also need to be looking at where they are in that lease, because that's going to that may motivate the landlord to negotiate with them in earnest, as opposed to kind of play hardball with them.
Yeah, and what I mostly see is that landlords generally, when a tenant sells their business, the landlord rarely will actually let the seller off the hook of the lease. So let's say they're in the middle of a 5-year term. They will assign the lease to the buyer. And so what that does is it gives the buyer all the rights to the premises, just like the seller has, but they don't take the seller off the lease. Sellers hate that for obvious reasons, right? It's like, why would I be obligated to the lease? I don't own the business. And the landlord politely says, well, we know you pay on time every month for the last 20 years. We don't know who you're selling the business to. And so oftentimes they'll require the seller to stay on the lease. Now, when that lease expires, then it would be renegotiated with the new owner. I've seen many times that if you push the landlord, the seller can often negotiate a shorter term to get off the obligation. In other words, let's say there's 3 years left on the lease, but the seller goes to the landlord and says, listen, keep me on for 12 months. After 12 months, take me off. And that'll give enough history and track record for the new buyer that they pay on time. So it's all negotiable, but I think the point is, as Craig said, really it's about making sure the buyer has a conversation with the landlord or the seller sooner rather than later about getting assignment of that property. I'll tell you one quick story. I worked with a practice that was buying another practice, and for whatever reason, signed the lease assignment agreement before buying the practice. In other words, they obligated themselves to paying the rent on the building for a practice that they had not yet purchased. And that individual said, well, the selling doctor's reimbursing me every time I write that rent check. And I said, well, what happens if that seller stops reimbursing you? You're on the hook. Now, fortunately, it all worked out okay because the transaction did occur. But there's a real timing issue of making sure that all of these details with the landlord get worked out and, by the way, are contingent on the purchase agreement so that you as the buyer don't become obligated to that real estate until you know for sure you own that practice.
Yeah. I guess maybe there's a separate conversation for another day from a seller's perspective, if you're going to be entering into a lease, make sure the terms in that lease will not impact your ability to sell your practice if that's going to happen. So I'm sure maybe that's a separate conversation for another day. But okay, so you've gone through this process, a letter of intent. Maybe when does this actually become final? Is there another contract that's binding? How does that actually sort of wrap up there and actually become binding?
Typically what happens is the letter of intent is submitted by the buyer to the seller. That has all basically a summary of all the understanding of both parties, price, what's being sold, timelines, what's not being sold, all that. Once that is executed by both parties, then really the hard work begins of really doing what we call the deeper dive due diligence, which is really taking a very deep look under the hood and making sure that you're understanding what you're purchasing. At the same time, this is when your legal team would step in and start drafting what's called the purchase agreement. The purchase agreement is the actual legally binding document that transfers ownership from one party to the other. The letter of intent is basically that. It's a letter of intention. It is legally binding, but it's not binding you to go through with the transaction. That's something that often gets confused. So a letter of intent, while it's a legal document, it's not obligating either party to go through with the transaction. It's just saying, this is my intention. The most important part about an LOI for a buyer is that you build in an exclusivity clause that tells the seller, you can't go shop you can't try to sell this practice to somebody else now that you have my offer. So basically takes the practice off the market for 30 or 60 or 90 days while you're doing the deeper dive due diligence as the buyer.
Got it.
And during that period, that's when the purchase agreement gets drafted and executed. And then there's a agreed upon closing date at some point in the future, which is the legal date in which the assets actually transfer from one owner to the other.
In terms of the scenario where an associate's going to be buying in over time, how do you see that valuation play out? Does that value increase, or is that revalued throughout the time period that happens? Is there an agreed upon price in the very beginning and it's just sort of amortized over that time period? How do you typically see that work?
Well, from the standpoint of the buyer, they're going to want to value it probably when they started.
Yeah.
And as the practice grows, they say that they're a part of that growth. But at the same time, the seller, as Mick alluded to earlier, if they're buying over time, the seller should be able to sell based on the value of the practice at that time versus someday, months or years in advance. The practice has been growing, and the buyer, the associate, has been compensated fairly for that, through their compensation. But the value of the practice and everything running it, then the seller should sell based on the value of the practice at that time and place.
One of the common comments or questions that we get from buyers that are associates. Let's take a $1 million revenue generating practice. The associate comes in and says, I'm going to work for a year, and in a year from now, the practice is going to be generating $1.5 million in revenue or $2 million. Aren't I now just paying a premium for all the work that I've done, to grow this practice? And to Craig's point, we always remind them, well, you were paid for the work that you did. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're buying a bigger practice that's worth more, but that should be a good thing to you. The only exception could be is if the associate brought in really some very unusual skill set that really drove the revenue of the practice up over and above what would normally be considered expectations of an associate doctor providing services. Then I could see an associate arguing, hey, listen, there's a little bit of equity that I've earned because I brought value to the business. But generally, in my opinion, when an associate brings value, they're being paid for that value as a worker bee in the practice. Yes, it's going to drive the value up, but you're buying a more valuable business. And so there should be a justification for the seller to ask for a higher price.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think there's several more hours of stuff we can get into in this whole process here, but out of respect for both of your times, I want to ask just one more question here. And it's something I've heard a lot about. You mentioned that there's a large percentage of practices anticipating selling over the next few years, right? Over the next 5 years or whatever it may be. But I've also heard that there's a sort of a gap between potential sellers and that next generation of associates wanting to get into ownership and take on ownership from them. Do you see that there's a gap, and how do you bridge that? Like, how do you connect the current doctors wanting to sell in the near future to that next generation of associates?
Wow, you just asked the biggest challenge that Craig and I deal with really in our roles at Vision Source, and that is we have dozens and dozens of practices for sale. Many of them are in rural markets, and we can't find buyers. Young optometrists don't want to go to the country to practice. Very few of them do. But the rural practices can be some of the most valuable and profitable practices because occupancy costs are typically lower and staff wages are typically lower. And so there are some very, very profitable rural practices, but many young ODs don't want to be in the country. So Craig and I have the challenge of getting a call from a rural member that says, I've got this practice, I need to find a buyer. And we're looking at each other thinking, how are we going to do this? One thing that we just launched was a new VisionSourceNext.com website, a platform that allows our members to post their practices for sale. And so somebody who is not a member that's looking for a practice can go to this site, VisionSourceNext.com, and they can look at practice listings with some limited information. We have to respect confidentiality. But if you see a practice of interest, it will ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We'll get approval from the selling doctor to disclose more information about the practice. And that allows a potential buyer to take a deeper dive and look at that opportunity. We just launched that Q4 of this last year, and we're building the listings now. And that's one of the big projects that Craig is working on. But that's one of the strategies that we have to marry the practices together.
You know, one of the other things that I think is really encouraging is as we have been working with these schools, I see third years, and I'm actually working with about fourth year students right now that are looking to buy practices as soon as they possibly can. They've identified them. They're going back. In some cases, they're in their small hometowns, which is great. And those may be Vision Source practices, or they may be independent practices that want to join Vision Source. And so it's really encouraging to me to see that young entrepreneurial spirit with these younger, students coming out. They're already thinking way ahead in their future and planning for it. And we're having multiple calls throughout their fourth year on how to get it done and to put the foundation in place so that when they are licensed and can make that happen, that they do. So that's been really encouraging. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I will put I'll put links to all the resources you mentioned and everything about both of you and Vision Source in the show notes, which anyone can just scroll down in whatever app you're using to listen to this, and you'll find that there. Where can people find you, follow you, learn more about what you're doing?
Well, certainly just contacting me directly at mkling@visionsource.com. I'm certainly happy to field any questions or comments. Would be probably the most efficient way to reach me.
Yeah, and the same with me is going to be C Moritz, Moritz at visionsource.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, so I can be found there as well.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate both of your time. This was phenomenal, and I think there's so much more to dive into even after this. For the listener, really appreciate your time, and we will catch all of you on the next episode. Take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.